Chapter 22 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. The Last Years of Paul. 262. Had Paul's life ended with the Roman imprisonment recorded in Acts, he would still have performed the work which has made his name historic. Not only had he personally established Christianity in most of the chief centers of the empire, but from them the faith had rapidly spread into the contiguous regions. There is evidence shortly after that it had permeated the whole of Asia Minor, 1 Peter 1:1, had entered Illyricum, or as it was later called Dalmatia, 2 Timothy 4:11, and had possibly found its way into Gaul, 2 Timothy 4:11. Converts had been made in various ranks of society. The majority were probably of the middle class, and it should be remembered that even the slaves to whom frequent reference is made, Ephesians 4:5, Colossians 3:22, 1 Peter 2:18, often included intelligent and educated men. Even in Corinth, where most of the early disciples were from, the lower orders. 1 Corinthians 1:26, 7:11, we read of Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, Acts 18:8, and Erastus, the treasurer of the city, Romans 16:23. While in Ephesus some of the wealthy Asiarchs were the apostles' friends. Gentile and Jew, masters and slaves, educated and ignorant, rich and poor, had been united in a few years into a new confraternity. Moreover, the apostle had, by his epistles, put in permanent form his whole system of instruction. He had fully interpreted to the Gentiles Jesus, the Messiah. Through his ministry, whatever others may have done, Christianity had unfolded its message to the world and attained complete consciousness of its independent mission. 263. There is reason, however, to believe that Paul's life did not end with his appeal to Caesar, awaiting the issue of which Luke's narrative closes. That the apostle was martyred at Rome under Nero is the constant testimony of tradition from the earliest times, and may be accepted without doubt. The year of his death is more open to question. Tradition, first mentioned by Eusebius, placed it in A.D. 67 or 68. Even if this be too late, a period of time certainly elapsed between the close of the 2 years mentioned in Acts 28:31 and his martyrdom, for it is utterly incredible that he died before the outbreak of Nero's persecution in the summer of A.D. 64. Did he then continue a prisoner, or was he released on his appeal to Caesar and allowed to resume his work? The reasons for the latter supposition, quite apart from the question of the genuineness of the pastoral epistles, are very strong. 264. In the first place, he confidently expected to be released, Philippians 1:25, 2:24, and his execution must have been based on his knowledge of the situation. In the second place, his previous treatment by Roman officials makes his release probable. He was regarded as a Jew who had a controversy with his fellow religionists, and as Judaism was a legalized religion, its internal dissensions were no affair of the state. Not until the outbreak of the Neronian persecution were Christians punished by the Romans for being such, and although the Jews accused Paul of offenses of which officials could take cognizance, Acts 18:18, 24:5, yet in every case when he made his defense and the real nature of his dispute appeared, he was either discharged or acknowledged to be guiltless. It is altogether probable, therefore, that when his case came before Caesar, he was acquitted. In the third place, tradition asserts his release. Clement, AD 96, of Rome, wrote of him that He taught the whole world righteousness and reached the furthest bound of the West, which in one writing from Rome can hardly mean less than that the apostle had visited Spain, and this implies his release. In like manner, the Muratori fragment, AD 170-200, mentions the journey to Spain as if it were generally believed, and the same tradition appears in early apocryphal Acts. Finally, Eusebius gives it as a current report that the apostle was released, resumed his ministry, and was again arrested and suffered martyrdom at Rome. It is true that the witnesses to the tradition are not many, but there is no opposing tradition. It is true also that no trustworthy historical remains exist of Paul's work in Spain. There is, however, some evidence that Christianity existed in Spain as early as the reign of Nero. The absence of historical remains of Paul's visit is no disproof of the visit itself, nor is the tradition sufficiently explained as arising out of the apostle's known wish to visit Spain. Romans 15:24. Taking the evidence as a whole, when combined with the probabilities of the situation as exhibited above, there is reason to believe that the appeal to Caesar resulted in Paul's liberation and the resumption of his missionary activity. 265. This conclusion is further assured by the epistles to Timothy and Titus, sections 175 to 180. They are certainly to be assigned to this period of the apostle's life. It is quite impossible to place 1 Timothy and Titus in the narrative of Acts. It has been sought to do this by assuming extended, unrecorded journeys during the Ephesian ministry of Paul, on one of which, having left Timothy in charge of the church at Ephesus, 1 Timothy 1:3, he went to Crete and placed Titus in charge, Titus 1:5. But this is hardly compatible with this description of his stay in Ephesus as having lasted 3 years, Acts 20:31. Again, it has been suggested that Timothy was left at Ephesus after the apostle had taken leave of the elders at Miletus on his last journey to Jerusalem, Acts 20:38, and that Titus was left at Crete when the ship bearing Paul to Rome touched at Fair Havens, near to the city Lasca, Acts 20:7-8. 1 Timothy, then, is supposed to have been written shortly after Paul left Miletus, and Titus shortly after his arrival at Rome. But in this case it is strange that he should have written to Timothy that he hoped to rejoin him shortly, 1 Timothy 3:14, or that he should have written to Titus to meet him at Nicopolis, because he had determined there to winter, Titus 3:12. Moreover, on any view which accepts the integrity of these epistles, the prevalence and character of the errors against which the letters warn make it impossible to assign them to the period covered by Acts, especially since, in his address to the Ephesian elders, Paul represents the false teachers as certain to arise, but as still in the future, Acts 20, verses 29-30. 2 Timothy also cannot be assigned satisfactorily to the imprisonment of Acts. The statement that he had left Trophimus at Miletus sick, chapter 4, verse 20, was not true of his visit to that place on the way to Jerusalem, Acts 20:15. For Trophimus was with him in Jerusalem, Acts 21:29. These views would also separate the epistles from the other pastorals by several years, whereas the striking community of thought and language certainly locates them in one period of the apostle's life. The effort, therefore, to insert them in the Acts, and at the same time to accept their integrity and Pauline authorship, must be abandoned. 266. These epistles, then, must be placed in the period subsequent to Paul's release and throw light on the last years of his ministry. It is not possible, indeed, to determine from them his movements in detail. It is natural, however, to suppose that from Philippians 2:19 that he went immediately after his release to Philippi. From there he may have gone to Colossae, Philemon 22, and thence to Crete, Titus 1:5, on his way to Spain. Or he may have abandoned his earlier purpose to visit Asia and have gone at once to Spain. On his return he may have visited Crete on the way to Asia, and from the latter have gone into Macedonia, 1 Timothy 1:8. It is also impossible to determine whether 1 Timothy or Titus was written first. They cannot, however, have been written later than A.D. 66. The Nicopolis, Titus 3:12, where he proposed to winter, is usually identified with the city of that name in Epirus. But whatever the direction of his movements, it is clear that he was actively engaged both in founding new churches, as in Crete, and in revisiting the older ones. With him, others cooperated, some of them men formerly associated with him, and others like Artemas and Zenas, Titus 3:12 and 13, of whom we have not heard before. Meanwhile, in all probability, the Neronian persecution had broken out in Rome, and it could not but have made the apostle more anxious to complete his work. In 1 Timothy and Titus, however, there is no allusion to it. We only learn from them of the restless activity of the apostle and his intense desire that his churches should be true to the faith and should honor by their lives the Christian name. 267. The first epistle to Timothy and that to Titus illustrate the growing need which the apostle felt of care in the regulation of the organized life of his churches. His purpose was not in the least to advance organization. He does not direct any addition to existing offices, nor exalt one above another. The only factor not hitherto mentioned is the list of widows supported by the church, and this too was evidently an established custom. His aim was rather to prevent abuses in the selection of officials and of subjects of aid. His language shows his sense of the importance of the church as an organized society, 1 Timothy 3:14 through 16, and the need of maintaining a holy and commendable life. This was only the practical application of the idea of the church universal, which he had given in the epistle to the Ephesians. 268. Yet these epistles do disclose something of the organization of the churches. Timothy and Titus had clearly been left in charge temporarily, not as permanent officials consisted of overseers or elders, the two terms being convertible, and deacons, see section 260. The former were rulers, the latter ministers to the poor. On the elders had devolved more and more the work of teaching, 1 Timothy 3:2, 1 Timothy 5:17, Titus 1:9, 2 Timothy 2:2. That this was not confined to them appears from the very injunctions against false teachers. Neither did all the elders devote themselves to teaching, 1 Timothy 5:17, but those that did were to have double honor. In short, we notice that while the freedom of public teaching had not ceased, the burden of regular instruction was devolving more on the overseers of the church, and it was plainly the view of the apostle that this was a needed safeguard of the truth. This indeed was but a further application both of the original duty of the elder and of what Paul had already taught in Ephesians 4, verses 11 through 16. Yet a new emphasis is evident. Out of the eldership the idea of an established teaching, as well as ruling body, had begun to emerge. 269. The epistles further show the perils to which the churches were exposed from false teaching and unholy living. This is a strange but instructive fact. The apostle predicted that it would become more and more the case. His view of the future was not that of an idealist. Error and sin were manifesting themselves within the body. The congregations contained many elements. Some were attracted who did not fully apprehend the gospel. Half-converted Jews brought in religious fables and fanciful speculations about Scripture and the spirit world. Religious excitement sometimes engendered fanaticism. Philosophic theories were substituted for the apostolic faith. Christianity had to defend its purity and its lofty moral ideal, as well as prove its right to exist at all. Hence, the apostle's stress on holy character. Christianity, he repeats, must be kept honorable. Zeal for righteousness and all the kindred virtues is urged, no less than fidelity to truth. Perhaps he was partly influenced by the growing hatred of the church by paganism, and by the vile misrepresentations of the new sect, which were beginning to be circulated. There were also real perils within the churches themselves. These epistles testify to the strenuousness with which the apostle of faith wrought out, as the fruit of faith, a holy life, and insisted upon it to his converts. He knew that only a holy life could successfully meet the world's attack upon the faith itself. 270. 2 Timothy discloses an entire change in Paul's situation. He is again a prisoner at Rome. Chapter 1, verse 8, verse 12, verse 17, chapter 2, verse 9, chapter 4, verse 6. Charged with being a malefactor. Chapter 2, verse 9. He has had one trial at which, though deserted by even his friends, the Lord delivered him, as he puts it, out of the mouth of the lion. Chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. But he fully expects death. Chapter 4, verse 6. He is sorely troubled also by the defection and absence of some of his friends. Chapter 4, verse 10. And by the positive enmity of others who bore the Christian name and who hailed from Asia. Chapter 1, verse 15. Alexander the coppersmith had done him much evil. Chapter 4, verse 11. Many supposed that he had testified before the tribunal against Paul. Yet other friends, some of them new to the history, chapter 4, verse 21, were with him. These scanty allusions evidently imply that he had been again arrested, where or why we know not, and had been again sent to Rome. He was now charged with crime by the Roman authorities themselves. It may be that he was charged with complicity in the burning of Rome. It may be that the charge was hostility to established customs and weakening imperial authority. There were evidently several charges, for though at first not condemned, he was still held a prisoner. He does not say that he was charged with being a Christian. Yet that was evidently the animus of the charge. The Roman authorities were also adverse to him. He had no hope of final acquittal. Clearly, their attitude had much changed since Philippians was written. This makes it probable that the Neronian persecution had meanwhile occurred. However inadequate the proof of guilt might be, the Christian apostle was certain that he would be condemned. 271. Under these circumstances, his second letter to Timothy was written. He wished Timothy to come to him, chapter 4, verses 9 and 21. While calling him to his side, he takes the opportunity of pouring out his heart to his beloved friend in exhortation and encouragement. There is certainly no reason to suppose, as some have done, that we have here two letters combined, one urging Timothy to come to Paul, the other directing him how to carry on his work. For the charge to Timothy in this letter is not, like those in 1 Timothy, to carry on a specific work. in a specific place, but it is a general exhortation to Timothy's subsequent life, and Paul's impending death made him feel that he must not lose an opportunity of giving his farewell testament to his son. Hence he exhorts Timothy to be true to him and to his teaching amid increasing perils. Chapter 1. To be faithful to duty, giving heed to his own life and faith, diligently upholding truth and resisting temptation. Chapter 2. He warns him that error will increase and encourages him to resist it by recalling how he himself had suffered in the service, and by pointing him to the Scriptures as the sure rule of faith and life. Chapter 3. With a repeated charge to fidelity, chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, he tells of his own expectation of death and joy in it, of his desire to see Timothy again, chapter 4, verses 6 through 9, and closes with items of news and greetings, chapter 4, verses 10 through 22. With this letter, our knowledge of Paul's life ends. Tradition affirms that he was beheaded on the Ostian Way. End of chapter 22.